Thank you, Senator Brown. Senator Lyneham.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. If we can think of Australia's Federation of States being like a family, there is one family member that needs more than a good talking to. It needs an intervention. South Australia needs intervention because its problems are self-inflicted and because too many South Australian politicians have developed a monstrous sense of entitlement. If the South Australian government was a person, it would be an obese 40-year-old man with awful body odour who lives with his mother, refuses to work and plays Xbox all day. He pauses only to demand more cheesels and iced coffee or to complain when the lights go out. It really is that bad. Over the last 5 years, every category of private investment in South Australia has fallen. While population and employment growth in other states have risen steadily, the graph for both indicators in South Australia is as flat as the Nullarbor Plain. And it's heading for a cliff as thousands of young South Australians follow the jobs interstate. Unless its course changes, South Australia risks becoming one big, barren, candle-lit retirement village. The economy of Western Australia left South Australia far behind years ago, and now it appears the tiny ACT could overtake South Australia within 20 years. And the ACT can achieve this despite its primary products being bull dust and hot air. The only economic competition left open to South Australia will be the race with Tasmania to the bottom. Sadly, the lone positive influence the South Australian politicians are having on Australia right now is to make politicians from other states feel better about themselves. It's hard to say exactly why South Australian legislators are so consistently terrible, but there seems to be a sizeable voting bloc of whinging Wendy's and doctors' wives who like to be represented either by doe-eyed Greens who have never grown up or shameless populists and protectionists. They are professional virtue signallers. They might fly economy and wear cheap suits, but they are costing us billions with the most irresponsible approach to governance imaginable. They claim to be servants of the people, but they are every bit as dodgy with other people's money as the shonkiest crony capitalist. Even the most reasonable South Australian politicians these days seem to believe their constituents will be unable to stand unless propped up by elaborate government schemes. They insult them with their low expectations.
Senator Sterle. Sorry, Senator Lyneham. Point of order, Senator Sterle.
No, I haven't got the order in front of me, but someone will remind me. But Senator Lyneham, as amusing as he can be, is actually casting aspersions on members of another parliament within Australia. And I'd ask Mr Acting Deputy President if you could just remind the senator of the standing order that I've forgotten.
Thank you, Senator Lyneham.
I don't standing order, Mr Acting Deputy President.
I'll get some advice on standing order 193 from the clerk, but it would assist the chair if you didn't cast any aspersions towards members from the other place.
If all they did was turn their own state into an economic basket case, perhaps we could live with it. But the dysfunction of the state now affects us all. This week I was visited by Louise Burge, who is still counting the cost of floods on her property near Deniliquin in southern New South Wales. The damage was greatly exacerbated by releases from the Hume Dam as part of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. You can understand why she is so outraged by suggestions from South Australia that yet more water should be sent down the river. As chair of the recent Senate inquiry into the Basin Plan, I heard testimony from dozens of people in Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria who have suffered greatly, losing their jobs, businesses and regional communities because of water buybacks in their area, turning productive irrigation farms into dryland farms. And yet, the primary concern of some South Australian politicians appears to be that people visiting holiday houses in Goolwa might miss out on watching gigalitres of fresh water flow into the ocean every day. Likewise, the submarine contract is no joke to the rest of us. While we need submarines, it will cost every Australian thousands of dollars to let South Australians have a crack at making them, despite the sorry history of the air warfare destroyers. If you recall, in 2007 we ordered 3 such ships to be built in South Australia. Even now, not one ship has been delivered and costs have been blown out by more than $1 billion. I should at least acknowledge the South Australian Premier Jay Weatherill for recognising something has to be done about his economy and opening up the debate about nuclear technology. Initiatives in the nuclear field could pull the state out of its malaise. A large-scale waste repository alone by itself could attract billions for the state with little or no risk. Thousands of my constituents in southern Sydney currently live within a few kilometres of nuclear waste held temporarily in a shed at Lucas Heights. Because of the laws of physics, there is no increase in radiation beyond the gates of the facility. However, creating a permanent repository in South Australia, much further away from people than a deposit in Sydney, sends the South Australians and their representatives into paroxysms of rejection. With the recent backtracking from the South Australian opposition leader on the issue, I can confidently predict a large-scale permanent nuclear waste repository won't happen in South Australia. If South Australia is to become a useful member of the Federation, it needs to change. Like other Australians, South Australians would be better off concentrating on areas where we have natural advantages, such as agriculture, mining and tourism. No taxpayers' money is needed to support these. Simply reducing red tape would go a long way to encourage more investment. The potential expansion of Olympic Dam should have South Australian politicians bending over backwards to help the project proponents make the necessary cuts to their costs. And they should be bending over backwards to ensure that future approval processes will be less arduous than the processes of the past. But instead, we have South Australian politicians promising that approval processes will be more arduous and costly. Allowing farmers to grow genetically modified crops, like in WA and Victoria, would also be important. Genetic modification can help us feed the world's poor. Pandering to thoroughly debunked and anti-scientific fear-mongering about genetic modification is a luxury that South Australia, and indeed the rest of Australia and the world, cannot afford. South Australia desperately needs to reform its electricity industry. Poor electricity policy burdens its citizens, has made manufacturing in the state unsustainable, raises the operating costs of all businesses, including tourism, and leaves the state dependent on others. It should allow all forms of power generation, including nuclear power, on equal terms and without subsidy, so that the lowest cost suppliers succeed. The South Australian Government should cut its spending, such as by abolishing the wide range of subsidies it irresponsibly doles out to home-owning pensioners. These subsidies just reinforce South Australia's status as the world's biggest retirement home. The South Australian Government should reduce taxes so as to make South Australia a place where at least some people want to live and do business. And it should make it easier to establish and operate a business in South Australia than in any other state. Meanwhile, the best thing we can do to help South Australia get over its addiction to other people's money is to stop giving it to them. The federal government should provide fewer transfers and special payments to all states and tax them less, but allow them to raise their own taxes. It would concentrate the minds of South Australians wonderfully if we started to return GST revenues to states based on what they generate, or at least if we doled revenue out on an equal per capita basis. But currently, when an average Australian gets $1 of GST revenue, each South Australian gets $1.42. We should respond less to all their bleatings for money, for water, for power and for anything else, until such time as they can demonstrate they can behave like responsible adults in the Federation.
Thank you, Senator.